Blood pounded behind her ears, drowning out the polite, vicious murmurs echoing off the vaulted ceilings. They had placed her chair at the far end of the long table, past the salt, past the gleaming silver, wedged humiliatingly close to the drafty servant's door. A deliberate, calculated insult. She stared at the cheap, unadorned porcelain, nails digging into her palms, preparing to swallow her pride. Then came the brutal, agonizing scrape of heavy mahogany against stone. The Duke of Westlake was dragging his chair down the length of the room. Rain lashed against the leaded glass of the grand foyer, leaving Lydia shivering in a cloak that smelled distinctly of damp sheep. She stood off to the side, dripping quietly onto the pristine marble floor of Highgate Manor. Footmen in livery the color of clotted cream glided past her, their eyes carefully fixed on the middle distance, pretending the wet, impoverished cousin of the host simply did not exist. Lydia hated them. She hated the footmen. She hated the towering floral arrangements that smelled oppressively of lilies and decay. But most of all, she hated herself for coming. Her stomach cramped, a sharp, twisting ache of hunger and nerves. She dug her teeth into her lower lip, tasting copper. Her boots, resoled twice and still letting in water, felt like blocks of ice. "Ah, Lydia, you made it." Aunt Catherine materialized from the drawing room, swathed in violently purple velvet. She didn't offer a hug. She didn't even extend a hand. Catherine simply looked down her long powdered nose at the puddle forming around Lydia's boots. The older woman smelled of stale lavender and gin, a sweet cloying mixture that made Lydia want to gag. "The roads were mud," Lydia said. Her voice was too loud in the cavernous space. She winced internally. She sounded defensive. The carriage threw a wheel near the crossroads. "Fascinating," Catherine drawled, already turning away. "Do try to dry off before you enter the dining hall. The carpets are Aubusson, and for heaven's sake pinch your cheeks. You look consumptive." Lydia was left alone again with the footman and the ticking of a massive grandfather clock. She stripped off her heavy sodden cloak, handing it to a reluctant servant whose nose wrinkled infinitesimally at the damp wool. Underneath, her dress was a faded slate blue. It was clean, but the fabric was tired, the cuffs slightly frayed. She tried to smooth the wrinkles over her stomach, her hands trembling. It wasn't fear, she told herself. It was just the cold. When the heavy oak doors to the dining hall finally opened, the noise hit her like a physical blow. Laughter, the clinking of crystal, the scrape of silver against fine bone china, a wall of heat and the rich, dizzying scent of roasted venison, butter, and heavy red wine rolled over her. She hesitated on the threshold. The table was enormous, a vast expanse of white damask stretching endlessly beneath 3 dripping crystal chandeliers. At the head sat her uncle, red-faced and boisterous. Radiating outward were the lords, ladies, and important guests, a sea of glittering jewels, stiff cravats, and bare, powdered shoulders. Lydia walked forward, her sensible boots completely silent on the thick rugs. She reached the middle of the table, looking for her name card. Not there. She kept walking, past the sprawling centerpiece of bruised autumn fruits, past the heavy silver salt cellars that marked the boundary between the honored guests and the lesser additions. She reached the lower end. The tablecloth here wasn't damask. It was plain linen, rougher, slightly yellowed. The grand chairs with their high carved backs gave way to simpler, lower seats. And there, at the very bottom, practically brushing the swinging door that led to the kitchens, was a small, smudged card. Miss Lydia Harding. Heat flared in her chest, rushing up her neck to burn her cheeks. It wasn't an oversight. Catherine managed her household with the precision of a military general. This was a statement. "You are here because of blood," the placement said, "but you do not belong." Lydia stood frozen. For a wild, erratic second, she considered turning around and walking out into the storm. Let the rain take her. Let them whisper. But she needed Uncle Nathaniel's signature on her brother's naval commission. If she walked out, Arthur's future was dead. So she pulled out the chair. The joints squeaked. She sat down. The draft from the kitchen door cut through her thin sleeves. Every time a servant rushed out with a platter, a blast of cold, grease-scented air slapped the back of her neck. She folded her hands in her lap. Her knuckles were white. She focused entirely on the empty plate in front of her. It had a small chip on the rim. She traced it with her gaze, over and over, refusing to look up, refusing to let them see the moisture gathering in her eyes. Conversation flowed far above her, a babbling brook of politics, gossip, and hunting yields. No one at the lower end spoke to her. The vicar's elderly sister, sitting to Lydia's right, was completely deaf and focused entirely on dismantling a bread roll. Then the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a sudden silence, but a subtle change in the air pressure. The volume of the laughter dipped. Heads turned toward the grand double doors. Lydia didn't look up. She kept tracing the chip on her plate. She felt a bead of sweat trickle down her ribs beneath her tight bodice. The room was too hot at the top, too cold at the bottom. "Your Grace," Uncle Nathaniel boomed, his voice echoing off the plasterwork. "We had feared the storm kept you." Footsteps, not the measured, light tread of a courtier, but the heavy, deliberate bootfalls of a man who didn't care about the Aubusson carpets. "Mud," a rough, gravelly voice said. "Lost a boot in it. Had to dig it out." Lydia finally glanced up, peering through the forest of candlesticks. The Duke of Westlake. Gideon. He was standing near the head of the table, handing a dripping leather riding crop to a horrified footman. He wasn't handsome in the way the other men were. His jaw was too square. His nose had a distinct bump from an old break, and his dark hair was wet and plastered to his forehead. He wore no cravat, just a shirt unbuttoned at the throat and a dark, damp riding coat that smelled strongly of wet horse and earth. Catherine fluttered, her purple velvet shaking. "Oh, Your Grace, please, your seat is right here at Nathaniel's right hand. We kept the soup hot." Gideon didn't move toward the plush, high-backed chair reserved for him. His pale, intelligent eyes were scanning the table. He looked past the jewels, past the plunging necklines, and the forced smiles. He stopped. Through the flickering candlelight, his gaze locked onto Lydia. Lydia stiffened. She looked away immediately, her heart kicking against her ribs like a trapped bird. Why was he looking at her? She was practically in the servants' hall. She shrank in her seat, wishing she could fold herself into nothingness. She felt acutely aware of her frayed cuffs, her damp hair, the humiliating placement of her chair. "Is the seat not to your liking, Your Grace?" Uncle Nathaniel asked, a note of panic bleeding into his bluster. Gideon remained silent for a long, agonizing moment. The silence in the room stretched, pulling taut, until the only sound was the clatter of a dropped spoon from a nervous maid. "No," Gideon said finally. The word dropped like a stone in a quiet pond. Before Catherine could launch into a flurry of apologies, Gideon reached out and gripped the top of his heavy, ornately carved mahogany chair. He didn't ask a footman to move it. He didn't signal for assistance. He pulled. Scrap! The sound was hideous. Wood protesting against stone. It ripped through the polite atmosphere, harsh and violent. Several dowagers flinched. Gideon dragged the chair backward. He stepped away from the head of the table, holding the back of the chair, and began walking down the length of the dining hall. Scrape. Thud. Scrape. He wasn't carrying it. He was dragging it, letting the heavy wooden legs gouge a path across the floorboards between the edges of the expensive rugs. The entire table watched in stunned, horrified silence. Uncle Nathaniel's mouth hung open. Catherine gripped her wine glass so tightly her knuckles turned white. Lydia's breath hitched. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing she were anywhere else. This was worse. The attention was 1,000,000 times worse than being ignored. He was making a scene, and he was dragging her right into the center of it. Scrape. The sound grew louder. He was passing the salt. He was passing the silver centerpieces. He was walking past the minor lords and the wealthy merchants. He stopped. Lydia opened her eyes. He was standing right beside her. The scent of him washed over her, rainwater, sharp pine, leather, and the faint bitter tang of tobacco. Up close, he was massive, blocking out the light from the nearest chandelier. Gideon looked down at the empty space between Lydia and the deaf vicar's sister. It was barely wide enough for a stool. He didn't care. He jammed his heavy mahogany chair into the gap, shoving the vicar's sister's chair a few inches to the right with a sharp screech of wood, and forced Lydia's chair an inch to the left. Then he sat down. The chair groaned under his weight. He was so close that his broad shoulder brushed against Lydia's arm. The damp wool of his coat was cold, but the heat radiating from his body was like a furnace. Lydia couldn't breathe. Her chest felt tight, the laces of her corset suddenly restricting her lungs. She stared at the side of his face. Gideon reached forward, grabbed a dry bread roll from the basket in front of the startled vicar's sister, and ripped it in half with strong, calloused fingers. "Pass the butter," he said to Lydia. His voice was low, pitched only for her. The dining hall remained entombed in a shocked, breathless silence. Nobody was eating. Nobody was speaking. 60 pairs of eyes were burned into the backs of their heads. Lydia's hand shook as she reached for the small porcelain butter dish. The knife clattered against the rim. She hated her weakness. She hated that he could reduce her to a trembling mess just by sitting down. She shoved the dish toward him, not looking at his face. "Thank you," he murmured. He didn't sound angry. He didn't sound triumphant. He sounded entirely ordinary, as if he sat at the bottom of the table next to the kitchen door every night of his life. Lydia finally found her voice. It was a raspy whisper fueled by a sudden, irrational spike of anger. "What are you doing?" "Eating," Gideon replied, slathering an obscene amount of butter onto the torn bread. He took a bite, chewing slowly. "We're trying to. The service down here is slow." "You are making a spectacle of me," she hissed, leaning slightly toward him so the others wouldn't hear. The scent of pine and leather was intoxicating, but she fought it, focusing on her fury. "As if I wasn't already humiliated enough, you had to drag the entire room's attention down here. Do you think this is a game? Do you think you're rescuing me?" Gideon swallowed. He turned his head, finally looking at her. His eyes were a startling pale gray, like a winter sky just before it snows. There was no pity in them. That surprised her. She had braced herself for pity, for the condescending charity of a great lord slumming it with the poor relations. Instead, she saw a hard, flat irritation. "I didn't move for you," he said bluntly. Lydia blinked. The wind knocked completely out of her sails. A flush of pure mortification crept up her neck. Of course he hadn't. How arrogant of her. She shrank back into her chair, her shoulders curling inward. "I moved," Gideon continued, his gaze drifting up the table to where Catherine and Nathaniel sat in paralyzed terror, "because I refused to sit next to a man who sells his tenant farmers' grain reserves to the French while his own villages starve." Lydia's head snapped back up. She stared at him. "Your uncle," Gideon clarified, his voice still low but laced with a quiet, dangerous steel, "is a pig, and his wife's perfume gives me a headache." But a short, breathless laugh punched its way out of Lydia's throat before she could stop it. She slapped a hand over her mouth, horrified. The sound was swallowed by the sudden crash of the kitchen door opening. A footman, laden with a silver tureen of soup, froze in his tracks as he nearly collided with the back of the Duke's chair. The servant's eyes bugged out of his head. He looked from the Duke to the empty space at the head of the table, and back again, visibly short-circuiting. "Right here, man," Gideon said, tapping the chip table in front of him. "I'm starving." The footman, trembling violently, managed to ladle a generous portion of steaming turtle soup into Gideon's bowl. He then turned to Lydia, hesitating. Before, the footman had skipped her entirely during the first bread service. Gideon didn't say a word. He just stared at the footman. The footman scrambled to fill Lydia's bowl next, splashing a few drops of hot broth onto the yellowed linen. Clumsy," Gideon noted softly. The footman practically sprinted back to the kitchen. Lydia picked up her spoon. The silver was lighter down here, the edges a bit dull. She took a sip. It was hot, rich, and heavily salted. The twisting cramp in her stomach began to uncoil. "They will punish me for this," Lydia said quietly, staring into her soup. The anger was gone, replaced by a weary resignation. Tomorrow, when you ride back to your massive estate, Catherine will make me pay for the embarrassment you caused them. Let them try, Gideon said. He didn't look at her. He was methodically dismantling a piece of roasted pheasant that another terrified footman had just delivered. You don't understand, she whispered. Her fingers tightened around the spoon. I need my uncle. My brother needs a commission. I have to swallow their insults because I have nothing else. You are a duke. You can do whatever you want. I have to live in the real world. She expected him to dismiss her concerns, to offer a platitude about standing up for oneself. Instead, Gideon stopped eating. He carefully placed his knife and fork down on his plate. He turned to her, his massive frame blocking the view of the gaping lords and ladies. Where is your brother hoping to serve? He asked. Lydia frowned, thrown by the pivot. The West Indies fleet. He wants to serve under Admiral Croft. Mona? Gideon nodded slowly. Croft owes me a favor. A large one. I pulled his son out of a gambling den in Mayfair last season. Lydia's heart stuttered. She stared at the side of his harsh, uncompromising profile. What are you saying? I'm saying, Gideon murmured, finally looking her in the eye, that you don't need your pig of an uncle. The draft from the kitchen door blew across the back of her neck again, but Lydia didn't feel cold. The heat from the man sitting beside her seeped into her bones. He wasn't smiling. There was no romance in his expression, no soft, flowery promises. He looked utterly serious, grounded in a reality that felt far more solid than the brittle, glittering world at the top of the table. Up at the head of the room, Uncle Nathaniel finally found his courage, or his foolishness. Your Grace, Nathaniel called out, his voice cracking slightly. Surely you would be more comfortable up here. The draft by that door is notorious. The entire room held its breath. Gideon didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply picked up his wine glass, a cheap, heavy goblet that lacked the delicate crystal ring of the ones at the high table. I'm perfectly comfortable, Nathaniel, Gideon said, his gravelly voice carrying easily over the silence. He took a slow sip of the dark wine. The company down here is infinitely superior. Oh, someone down the table gasped. Catherine looked as though she might actually faint, swaying dangerously in her purple velvet. Lydia felt a tight, painful knot in her chest finally break open. She didn't smile. She didn't bat her eyelashes. She picked up her own heavy goblet, her hand steady for the first time all evening. She took a sip. The wine was cheap and acidic, catching in the back of her throat. But to Lydia, it tasted like absolute victory. She set the glass down, the heavy thud mirroring the sound of the chair being dragged. She glanced sideways at Gideon. He was already back to chewing his pheasant, his jaw working rhythmically, completely ignoring the aristocratic wreckage he had just caused at the other end of the room. Lydia picked up her fork. For the first time in years, she realized she had an appetite. Poached pears arrived in a thick, cloying syrup that tasted faintly of burnt sugar. The dining hall had devolved into a low, strained murmur, entirely devoid of the earlier boisterous laughter. Up at the high table, Uncle Nathaniel was sweating through his collar, attempting to engage a deafened baron in conversation about turnip yields. Down by the drafty servants' door, Gideon of Westlake was meticulously slicing his pear, utterly unbothered by the suffocating tension he had orchestrated. Lydia stared at her own dessert. The syrup had congealed into a sticky film. She didn't touch it. Her adrenaline was crashing, leaving behind a hollow, vibrating exhaustion in her bones. The corset she wore, already laced too tight to hide the old fabric's poor fit, now felt like an iron cage around her ribs. You aren't eating, Gideon observed. He didn't look up from his plate. The scrape of his silver spoon against the chipped porcelain was the loudest sound in their immediate vicinity. I have lost my appetite, Lydia muttered. She kept her voice flat, staring straight ahead at the bruised fruit centerpiece. It tends to vanish when one is waiting for the executioner's axe. He paused, the spoon halfway to his mouth. They won't touch you. Not tonight. Tonight is not the rest of my life, she replied bitterly. She risked a glance at his profile. In the dimming candlelight, the bump on his nose caught the shadows. He looked rough, like a man carved from coarse sandstone rather than aristocratic marble. You get to ride away tomorrow, Your Grace. I'm trapped here until Arthur is settled. Catherine will make me pay for every ounce of embarrassment she suffered tonight, and she has a very long memory. Gideon swallowed his bite of pear. He set the spoon down and leaned back in the heavy mahogany chair, the wood groaning under his shifting weight. He smelled of rich port wine now, layering over the damp wool and pine. I told you, Croft owes me. I will write the letter. Men of your station do not write letters for impoverished cousins they met an hour ago, Lydia said. She finally turned to look at him fully, her jaw tight. What is the price? His pale gray eyes flicked to hers. For a fraction of a second, surprise flashed in them, quickly replaced by a slow, calculating appraisal. He didn't offer a patronizing smile. He didn't insult her intelligence by pretending it was pure altruism. I despise Nathaniel, Gideon said, his voice dropping to a low rumble that vibrated beneath the chatter of the room. He is a coward, a cheat, and a sycophant. Watching him squirm is a rare pleasure. You gave me an excuse to publicly humiliate him without violating the strict laws of hospitality I am supposedly bound by. He leaned in slightly, the heat of his shoulder radiating toward her cold arm. Call it a transactional courtesy. You provided the stage. I am providing the Navy Commission. Turker. Lydia studied his face. He was completely serious. There was no hidden predatory gleam, no expectation of gratitude. It was a cold, hard bargain, and God help her, she preferred it that way. It was a language she understood. Before she could answer, Catherine stood up. The scraping of her chair was a polite, muffled sound on the thick Aubusson carpet. Ladies, her aunt announced, her voice brittle and sharp as shattered glass. Shall we leave the gentlemen to their port? The customary withdrawal. Lydia's stomach plummeted. For the past hour, Gideon's massive, intimidating presence had been a shield. Now she was being thrown into the wolves' den without him. She stood slowly. Her knees felt weak. Around her the grand ladies were rising, a rustling sea of expensive silks and heavy velvets. Not one of them looked in her direction. Go, Gideon murmured, pouring himself another glass of cheap wine from the lower table's decanter. He didn't look at her. Keep your chin up. Do not let her see you bleed. Lydia didn't reply. She joined the end of the procession, trailing behind the vicar's sister. The drawing room was stifling. A massive fire roared in the marble hearth, rendering the air thick and dry. The women clustered in tight, exclusive circles, murmuring behind painted fans. Lydia retreated to the darkest corner of the room, near a heavy velvet curtain that smelled of dust and old camphor. She folded her hands tightly in front of her waist, trying to make herself as small as possible. It didn't work. Catherine detached herself from a group of dowagers and glided across the room. Up close, the older woman's face was a mask of cold fury, the heavy powder unable to hide the angry red splotches on her neck. She smelled strongly of gin and decaying lilies. You little viper, Catherine hissed, her voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the force of a physical blow. She didn't touch Lydia. She wouldn't risk wrinkling her purple velvet, but she stood uncomfortably close, invading Lydia's space. Aunt Catherine, I assure you. Shut your mouth, Catherine snapped. Her eyes were hard, flat beads of jet. Do you think I'm blind? Do you think I don't know exactly what you did? Batting your eyelashes like a common streetwalker, playing the pathetic, neglected orphan to draw the Duke's eye? Lydia's spine stiffened. The accusation was so absurd, so entirely divorced from reality, that it momentarily eclipsed her fear. I did nothing of the sort. I sat exactly where you placed me. And managed to ruin my dinner party, Catherine sneered. She leaned closer, her hot, gin-laced breath washing over Lydia's face. Listen to me very carefully, you ungrateful wretch. The Duke will be gone by noon tomorrow, and when his carriage passes the gates, you will be nothing but dirt beneath my shoes again. Arthur will never see that commission. Nathaniel will rip the paperwork to shreds. I will see you both turned out into the mud where you belong." Panic, cold and sharp, flared in Lydia's chest. The air in the room felt suddenly too thin to breathe. She wanted to scream at the unfairness of it, to claw at her aunt's powdered face, but Gideon's rough voice echoed in her mind. "Do not let her see you bleed." Lydia locked her knees. She met Catherine's furious gaze without blinking, forcing her breathing to remain slow and even. She said nothing. Catherine's eyes narrowed. The lack of a tearful apology unsettled her. She let out a quiet, contemptuous sound, a sharp exhalation through her nose, and turned on her heel, marching back toward the warmth of the fire. Lydia remained in the shadow of the curtain. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to clench them into fists to hide the tremors. She stared at the flames dancing in the hearth, feeling the overwhelming, crushing weight of her reality settling back onto her shoulders. A promise of a letter from a duke was smoke. Catherine's cruelty was stone. Dawn bled into the sky like a bruised plum, gray and heavy with the promise of more rain. Lydia had not slept. She had spent the night lying rigidly on her narrow cot in the drafty attic room, listening to the wind rattle the loose window panes. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the scrape of that mahogany chair and saw Catherine's hateful, jet-black eyes. By 6 o'clock, the chill in the room was unbearable. Lydia rose, shivering violently. She dragged her faded slate-blue dress back on. She owned no riding habit, no heavy morning gowns. The fabric felt stiff and damp from the residual humidity of the storm. She wrapped herself in a worn woolen shawl that smelled faintly of mothballs and slipped out of her room. The manor was dead quiet. The footmen were not yet at their posts, the fires not yet lit. The air in the grand corridors held the stale, lingering odors of the previous night. Cold beeswax, stale tobacco, and the faint, sour tang of spilled wine. Lydia needed to breathe. She needed to be away from the stifling silks and the judgmental portraits of Uncle Nathaniel's ancestors. She let herself out through the kitchen door, ignoring the startled glance of a scullery maid scrubbing a pot in the gloom. The morning air was biting, carrying the sharp metallic scent of wet earth and impending frost. Lydia pulled her shawl tighter and walked briskly toward the stables. It was the only place on the estate she truly tolerated. The animals didn't care about the frayed edges of her cuffs. The heavy wooden doors of the stable block were cracked open. Inside, the air was instantly warmer, thick with the comforting, heavy scents of fresh hay, warm horseflesh, and oiled leather. The rhythmic sound of a horse chewing oats was incredibly grounding. Lydia walked down the central aisle, letting her fingertips trail over the rough wood of the stall doors. She stopped by a large, gentle-eyed roan mare and leaned her forehead against the iron bars, closing her eyes. The tension in her neck began, minutely, to uncoil. "She bites if you crowd her." Lydia gasped, her eyes flying open. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Gideon was standing 3 stalls down. He wasn't dressed as a duke. He wore a heavy, unbleached linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up past his elbows, exposing thick forearms corded with muscle and dusted with dark hair. He wore worn leather breeches and scuffed boots caked in fresh mud. He was holding a large curry comb, and beside him stood a massive, ill-tempered-looking black stallion. He looked perfectly at home in the muck and the straw, far more so than he had in the dining hall. "Your Grace," Lydia stammered, taking a step back from the roan mare. Her cheeks burned. "I apologize. I did not realize anyone was awake." Gideon tossed the curry comb into a wooden bucket with a dull thud. He wiped his hands on a clean rag. "The horses don't care about the clock." He leaned against the stall door, studying her in the pale morning light filtering through the high windows. His gaze was heavy, taking in her thin shawl, the dark circles under her eyes, and the slight tremor in her hands. "You look awful," he stated bluntly. A startled, genuine laugh escaped Lydia's lips before she could catch it. It sounded rusty. "Your flattery is overwhelming, Your Grace. Truly." The corner of Gideon's mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but the hard lines around his jaw softened a fraction. "Gideon, if we are going to conspire against your aunt, you might as well use my name." He reached into the pocket of his breeches and pulled out a thick folded piece of parchment. It was sealed with heavy dark red wax, stamped with a crest Lydia couldn't quite make out in the dim light. He held it out. Lydia stared at it. The heavy parchment seemed to glow in the shadows. It was the answer to everything. It was Arthur's freedom. It was her escape from the crushing guilt of holding her brother back. She took a slow step forward. The hay crunched beneath her thin boots. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the rough texture of the paper. She didn't take it immediately. She looked from the letter up to his pale gray eyes. "Is this it?" she asked, her voice hushed. "A direct request to Admiral Croft," Gideon confirmed. "Arthur is to present himself at the Plymouth Naval Base by the end of the month. Croft will place him as a midshipman on the Defiance. It departs for the West Indies in 6 weeks." Lydia closed her fingers around the letter. It felt impossibly heavy. She pulled it to her chest, clutching it against her thin shawl. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the sudden agonizing burn of tears. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry, not in front of him. "I don't—" She swallowed hard, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I do not know how to repay you. I have nothing." "I told you the price last night," Gideon said, his voice quiet, devoid of its usual gravelly edge. "I got my entertainment. The debt is settled." Lydia opened her eyes. She looked at him, really looked at him. The harsh lighting in the stables revealed the deep lines of exhaustion around his own eyes, the slight tension in his shoulders. He was a man who possessed everything the world had to offer, yet he seemed entirely alienated by it. "Catherine threatened to throw us out," Lydia said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. The raw honesty of the stable air seemed to strip away her defenses. "Last night, she said Uncle Nathaniel would destroy the paperwork and we would be turned out into the mud." Gideon's expression darkened. The brief softness vanished, replaced by a cold, flinty anger that made the air in the stable feel suddenly dangerous. He didn't shout. He didn't swear. He just stared at the stable wall for a long moment, a muscle ticking in his jaw. "She will not throw you out," Gideon said softly. "She hates me. She has been looking for an excuse for 2 years." "She will not throw you out," Gideon repeated, turning his gaze back to her, "because I am not leaving." Lydia stared at him, uncomprehending. The scent of hay and horse sweat suddenly seemed overpowering. "What do you mean? Your carriage. Catherine said you were leaving at noon." "Plans change," Gideon said flatly. He pushed himself off the stall door. "The roads are a disaster. A wheel could break. The mud is impassable. It would be highly irresponsible of me to risk my horses." He patted the neck of the black stallion, who snorted and tossed its head. "I fear I'm stranded at Highgate Manor for the foreseeable future. A week, perhaps 2. Lydia's mouth fell open slightly. She recognized the lie for what it was, a blatant, arrogant fabrication designed to force himself into the household. "Uncle Nathaniel will see right through that." "Let him," Gideon said, a dangerous glint in his eye. "What is he going to do? Evict a duke?" He stepped closer to her. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest again, just like at the dinner table. He smelled of clean sweat and expensive saddle soap. "Take the letter, Lydia. Hide it. Send it with the postboy today. Do not let Nathaniel or Catherine see it." He looked down at her, his expression intense. "I will remain here until Arthur's commission is confirmed and he is safely on a carriage to Plymouth. They will not touch you while I am under this roof." Lydia clutched the parchment tighter against her chest. The wax seal felt warm against her skin. She looked up at this strange, rough man who had upended her life in 12 hours. The cynicism she had worn like armor for years cracked down the middle. "Why?" she whispered. Humiliating Nathaniel is one thing, but staying here? In this house? Why are you doing this? Gideon looked at her for a long time. The silence stretched, filled only by the rustle of straw and the breathing of the horses. He reached out, his large calloused hand moving slowly. For a terrifying second, she thought he was going to touch her face. Instead, his fingers brushed against the frayed, damp edge of her woolen shawl near her collarbone. The touch was incredibly light, a fleeting friction of rough skin against coarse wool, but it sent a jolt of pure electricity straight down her spine. Because, Gideon said, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur, I hate seeing a good horse kept in a bad stall, and I despise watching people get bullied by cowards. He stepped back, severing the connection. The cold, stable air rushed back in to fill the space between them. Go inside, he instructed, turning back to the bucket to retrieve his curry comb. Get some breakfast. Eat the good ham, not the scraps they leave at the end of the table. Lydia didn't argue. She turned and walked back down the aisle, her boots crunching softly on the hay. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She paused at the stable doors, looking back. Gideon was already brushing the stallion, his back to her, the heavy muscles of his shoulders shifting under the linen shirt. She stepped out into the freezing morning air. The wind bit at her cheeks, but she didn't feel the cold. She walked back toward the looming, oppressive silhouette of Highgate Manor. She had a letter to post, and for the first time in her life, she had a shield. When Lydia entered the grand foyer, the house had begun to wake. Footmen were carrying scuttles of coal, maids were dusting the heavy banisters, and standing at the foot of the grand staircase, looking apoplectic in a dressing gown of violently striped silk, was Uncle Nathaniel. He spotted Lydia immediately. His face, already ruddy by nature, deepened to a dangerous shade of magenta. He marched toward her, his heavy slippers slapping against the marble floor. "Where have you been?" he demanded, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. A maid nearby squeaked and scurried down a side hallway. "You look like a vagrant, tracking mud onto the floors." Lydia's grip on the letter beneath her shawl tightened. She forced herself to stand tall, refusing to shrink away from him as she usually did. "I was taking the air, Uncle." "Taking the air?" Nathaniel mocked, leaning in. He smelled of stale brandy and unwashed sleep. "You listen to me, you insolent little brat. Your aunt is beside herself. She spent the entire night suffering from palpitations because of your disgusting display of forwardness yesterday. You will go to her rooms right now. You will drop to your knees and you will beg her forgiveness." "I did nothing to apologize for," Lydia said. Her voice shook slightly, but the words were clear. Nathaniel's eyes bulged. He raised a meaty hand, pointing a thick, trembling finger directly at her face. "You will do as I say, or I swear to God, I will write to the Admiralty today and ensure your brother never sees the inside of a ship. I will ruin him. I will ruin you both." Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. She knew he meant it. "You won't be writing to anyone, Nathaniel." The voice came from the front doors. Nathaniel spun around, nearly tripping over the hem of his dressing gown. Gideon strolled into the foyer. He was still wearing the dirty linen shirt and the mud-caked boots. He carried a riding crop loosely in his right hand. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely relaxed, like a man taking a casual stroll through his own park. He walked past Nathaniel, his boots leaving distinct muddy tracks on the pristine marble. He stopped next to Lydia, effectively placing his large body between her and her uncle. Your Grace," Nathaniel spluttered, his bluster evaporating instantly, replaced by a nauseating panic. "I thought the servants said you were preparing to leave." "I found a problem with my carriage," Gideon lied smoothly, tapping the riding crop against his thigh. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was sharp in the quiet foyer. "A cracked axle. It will take days to repair. I'm afraid I must impose upon your famous hospitality a while longer." Nathaniel looked like he might swallow his own tongue. Of course, an honor, but if I may, Your Grace, this girl—" He gestured weakly toward Lydia. "She requires discipline, a family matter." Gideon stopped tapping the crop. He looked at Nathaniel. The pale gray eyes were flat and utterly dead. "I find family matters tedious," Gideon said softly. "What I find interesting, Nathaniel, is a conversation I had last week with the magistrate in the neighboring county. A fascinating discussion about discrepancies in the parish poor relief funds. Funds that I believe you oversee?" The remaining color rushed out of Nathaniel's face, leaving him a pasty, sickly white. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "I have decided to stay," Gideon continued, stepping closer to Nathaniel, forcing the older man to crane his neck back. "And while I am here, I expect the atmosphere to be pleasant. No raised voices, no threats in the foyer." He glanced sideways at Lydia. "And Miss Harding will take her meals in the family dining room, at the top of the table. The draft by that kitchen door is unacceptable." Nathaniel swallowed audibly. He looked like a man standing on the gallows. "Yes, Your Grace, whatever you wish." "Excellent," Gideon said, turning his back on Nathaniel with absolute dismissive contempt. He looked down at Lydia. "Ham, Lydia, do not forget." He walked away, heading toward the library, leaving a trail of mud and a thoroughly destroyed patriarch in his wake. Lydia watched him go, the heavy wax seal of the letter burning a hole against her chest. She had survived the night, and the game had entirely changed. Breakfast was an agonizing affair of porcelain and paranoia. Lydia stood at the threshold of the morning room, her stomach twisting into a tight, hard knot. The long, informal table was bathed in the weak gray light of the overcast morning. Uncle Nathaniel sat at the head, vigorously buttering toast with the frantic energy of a man trying to outrun an executioner. Catherine sat rigid at the opposite end, her face a mask of pale powder and pinched fury. And there, seated squarely at Nathaniel's right hand, was Gideon. He had bathed and changed into a dark, impeccably tailored coat that emphasized the sheer, intimidating breadth of his shoulders. He was systematically demolishing a plate of eggs and thick-cut ham. He didn't look up when Lydia entered, but he reached out with his left hand and dragged the heavy oak chair beside him backward. It scraped loudly against the floorboards. "Sit," the gesture commanded. Lydia walked forward. Her sensible boots felt too loud in the suffocating silence. She felt Catherine's eyes boring into the side of her head, hot and hateful. She sat down. The chair was still warm from the fire. A footman materialized instantly, his hands trembling as he set a plate before her. It wasn't the chipped porcelain from the night before. It was the good china, rimmed in gold. "Coffee, Miss Harding?" the footman whispered. "Yes, thank you," Lydia murmured. Her voice sounded too loud. "Pass the jam to your niece, Nathaniel," Gideon said casually, not looking up from his eggs. Nathaniel choked on his toast. He coughed, his face turning a mottled purple, before hurriedly shoving a heavy crystal jar of strawberry preserves down the table. It slid to a halt inches from Lydia's plate. "Thank you, Uncle," Lydia said. She kept her voice entirely flat. She picked up a silver knife and spread the jam on a piece of fresh, hot bread. She took a bite. It was sweet, rich, and tasted entirely of power. She risked a glance at Gideon. He was watching her from the corner of his eye. A silent, approving acknowledgement passed between them. "Eat the good ham," he had said. So she did. Once breakfast was mercifully concluded, Nathaniel fled to his study under the pretense of estate business. Catherine claimed a sudden, violent migraine and retired to her rooms. Lydia found herself standing alone in the grand hallway with the Duke. "The letter," Gideon said, turning to her. His voice dropped the polite, conversational tone he had used to terrorize Nathaniel. "Do you have it?" Lydia pulled the heavy parchment from the pocket of her slate-blue dress. It was warm from her body heat. "If I give this to the household postboy, Nathaniel will intercept it. He checks the outgoing mailbag every afternoon." "I know," Gideon replied. He raised a hand, snapping his fingers twice. From the shadows near the front doors, a man stepped forward. He was built like a brick wall, wearing a heavy riding cloak and a terrifying scowl. He looked less like a servant and more like a bare-knuckle boxer. "This is Higgins," Gideon said. "He rides for me. He will take it directly to the naval office in Plymouth. He does not stop for weather, and he certainly does not stop for your uncle." Lydia handed the letter to Higgins. The large man took it gently, tucking it into a leather pouch at his belt before bowing his head slightly and striding out the front doors into the miserable drizzle. Lydia watched the door close. A massive, crushing weight lifted from her chest, leaving her breathless. It was gone. The request was in motion. Arthur was going to be safe. She turned back to Gideon. He was watching her closely, his pale gray eyes analyzing the minute changes in her posture. 3 days, Gideon stated. 4, at the most, for a reply to reach us here. Can you survive 4 days of your aunt's glaring? Lydia let out a shaky, quiet breath. The corners of her mouth twitched. I have survived 2 years of it, Your Grace. 4 days with a bodyguard is a luxury. Gideon, he corrected roughly. If you call me Your Grace again while wearing a dress with frayed cuffs, I will assume you are mocking me. Lydia looked down at her wrists. He wasn't being cruel. He was merely stating a fact. My apologies. Gideon. The name felt heavy and strange on her tongue. Intimate. Go read a book, he ordered, turning away. I have to go look at a broken carriage wheel. I need to make sure my driver actually cracked the axle, or my entire excuse for staying here falls apart. The next 3 days were a masterclass in psychological warfare. The rain refused to let up, turning the estate into a muddy island. The household was trapped indoors. Uncle Nathaniel took to drinking heavily in his study before noon. Catherine drifted through the corridors like a vengeful, heavily perfumed ghost, her eyes tracking Lydia with a venomous, impotent rage. But they did not touch her. They did not speak a harsh word to her. The invisible, crushing shield of the Duke's presence covered Lydia entirely. Lydia spent her days in the library. It was the only room in the house that smelled of dust and old paper rather than stale wine or decaying lilies. Gideon joined her there most afternoons. He didn't offer to entertain her. He simply claimed a leather armchair by the fire, stretched his long, muscular legs out toward the hearth, and read. They sat in silence for hours. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was the comfortable, heavy quiet of two people who had absolutely no desire to perform for one another. On the afternoon of the third day, the fire was burning low, casting long, flickering shadows across the mahogany bookshelves. Lydia was staring blindly at a map of the West Indies, tracing the jagged coastlines with her fingernail, wondering where Arthur would end up. He is stealing from them. Lydia blinked, pulling her gaze from the map. Gideon was leaning forward in his chair, a thick leather-bound ledger resting on his knees. He had found Nathaniel's estate books. Who? Lydia asked softly. Your uncle, Gideon said. His jaw was clenched, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. He is overcharging his tenant farmers for seed by 40%, then buying the yield back at a fixed, deflated rate to sell to the crown. It's systematic starvation. He is bleeding them dry to pay for his wife's velvet dresses and his own bad gambling debts. Lydia set the map down. She felt a cold sickness in her stomach. I knew he was hard on them. I didn't know it was illegal. It's not illegal, Gideon corrected bitterly. He slammed the ledger shut. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet room like a gunshot. That is the problem. It is perfectly legal for him to be a parasite. The law protects the landholder, not the land. He tossed the heavy book onto the table beside him. He dragged a hand through his dark hair, looking exhausted and incredibly angry. He didn't look like a lord. He looked like a man who had seen too much rot and was tired of smelling it. You care, Lydia observed. Her voice was quiet in the dim room. More than you pretend to. Gideon looked at her. The pale light from the window caught the bump on his nose, the harsh lines of his face. I care about efficiency. A starving farmer cannot work a field. It is bad management. Do not lie to me, Lydia said. She surprised herself with the firmness of her tone. She stood up, her slate blue skirts rustling softly, and walked toward the fireplace. She stood a few feet from his chair, looking down at him. You sat beside me at dinner because you hated seeing a girl humiliated. You stayed in this miserable house because you hated seeing a bully win. You are reading those ledgers because you hate seeing people exploited. It isn't about management. You have a conscience, a terribly inconvenient one." Gideon stared up at her. For a long moment, the air between them grew impossibly thick. The scent of wood smoke, old leather, and his sharp, clean sweat seemed to fill her lungs, making it hard to breathe. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, bringing his face dangerously close to the frayed edge of her skirt. "My father," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly rasp, "was exactly like your uncle. Only he had a duchy to play with, not a minor country estate. He drank, he gambled, and he sold off our forests and our farms to pay for his mistresses in London. When I inherited the title 5 years ago, the estate was bankrupt. The tenants were dying of winter fever because their roofs had caved in. I spent 3 years in the mud, rebuilding it with my bare hands." He looked up, his eyes locking onto hers. They were no longer flat. They were burning. "I don't have a noble conscience, Lydia," he whispered harshly. "I just have a very deep, very violent hatred for men who take what isn't theirs and break what they are supposed to protect." Lydia swallowed hard. Her heart was beating a frantic, erratic rhythm against her ribs. She wanted to step back, to put distance between herself and the raw, unvarnished intensity of him. But she didn't. She held her ground. Without thinking, she reached out. Her hand trembled slightly as she laid her fingers gently on his broad shoulder. The wool of his coat was rough under her touch. Beneath it, she felt the rigid, coiled tension of his muscles. Gideon froze. He looked at her small, pale hand resting on his dark coat. He didn't pull away. Slowly, he reached up and covered her hand with his own. His palm was rough, heavily calloused from riding and working. He didn't stroke her skin. He simply held her hand there, pressing it firmly against his shoulder, anchoring himself to her touch. They stayed like that for a long time, bathed in the dying light of the fire, listening to the rain beat against the window panes. It wasn't a romance born of poetry or stolen glances. It was an understanding forged in mutual disgust for the world around them, a quiet, desperate recognition of a shared cynical reality. The sun finally broke through the clouds on the morning of the 6th day. It illuminated the mud outside Highgate Manor, turning the deep ruts into gleaming, treacherous trenches. Inside the house, the atmosphere had stretched so taut it felt ready to snap. Lydia was sitting in the morning room, pushing a piece of cold toast around her plate when the heavy front doors banged open. Footsteps pounded across the marble foyer. Heavy, booted footsteps. Higgins appeared in the doorway of the morning room. He was covered in mud from his boots to his hair, his riding cloak dripping filthy water onto the Aubusson carpet. He looked utterly exhausted, but he held a thick, sealed letter in his massive fist. He ignored Nathaniel, who was gaping at him from the head of the table. He walked straight to Gideon and handed him the dispatch. Gideon took it. He broke the heavy naval seal with his thumb, the crisp crack of the wax sounding louder than a bell in the silent room. He unfolded the thick parchment and read it quickly. His face gave away nothing. Lydia stopped breathing. Her hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table so tightly her knuckles turned bone white. The deafening roar of her own pulse drowned out the ticking of the grandfather clock. Gideon looked up from the paper. His gray eyes met hers. "Midshipman Arthur Harding," Gideon read aloud, his rough voice carrying clearly. "Ordered to present himself to the HMS Defiance at Plymouth Docks no later than the 12th of the month. Commission granted and signed by Admiral Croft." Lydia closed her eyes. A shuddering, jagged breath tore its way out of her throat. It was real. It was done. The iron cage she had lived in for 2 years shattered into 1,000 pieces. She felt hot tears pricking the corners of her eyes and furiously blinked them away. "Excellent news," Nathaniel croaked. His face was a sickly gray. He looked between Gideon and Lydia, realizing with a horrifying finality that his absolute control over his niece was gone. Gideon stood up. He folded the letter and tossed it onto the table in front of Lydia. He didn't look at Nathaniel. "Higgins," Gideon said, turning to his man, "go to the stables. Tell my driver the carriage axle has miraculously healed itself. Hitch the horses. We leave in an hour." Catherine, who had been sitting in frozen silence, let out a sharp, audible gasp. Her eyes darted to Lydia. The predatory gleam returned instantly. The Duke was leaving. The shield was dropping. Lydia saw it. She felt the cold draft of reality sweeping back into the room. Arthur was safe, but she was still here. She had no money, nowhere to go. She would be entirely at Catherine's mercy the moment Gideon's carriage rolled through the gates. Gideon saw it too. He didn't make a grand, sweeping speech. He didn't drop to one knee. He simply walked around the table and stopped behind Lydia's chair. "Pack your trunk," he said to her. The entire room went dead silent. Lydia twisted in her chair, looking up at him in shock. "What?" "Pack your trunk," Gideon repeated, his voice calm and entirely matter-of-fact. He looked at Catherine, his gaze flat and dangerous. "Miss Harding is leaving with me." "You cannot be serious!" Catherine shrieked, slamming her hands down on the table. The china rattled. "She is an unmarried woman. She is under our guardianship. You cannot simply take her away in your carriage like some camp follower. It will ruin her." "She is already ruined by association with you," Gideon retorted bluntly. He looked down at Lydia. "I have a massive estate in the north. It is drafty. It smells of sheep, and the steward is a half-blind idiot who can't balance a ledger to save his life. I need an auditor, someone who knows how a pig hides his truffles, someone who doesn't flinch at the mud." He extended a hand toward her. It was the same calloused, rough hand that had held hers by the fire. "My library is bigger than this one," he added softly, the gravel in his voice softening just for her. "And the ham is infinitely better. Come with me." Lydia stared at his outstretched hand. It wasn't a proposal of marriage. It wasn't a declaration of undying love. It was a job offer, a partnership, a chaotic, highly scandalous escape route into the unknown with a man who dragged heavy chairs across fancy floors just to spite a bully. It was the most romantic thing she had ever heard. Lydia didn't hesitate. She placed her small, pale hand into his large, rough one. His fingers closed around hers, a warm, solid iron grip. She stood up. She didn't look at Catherine or Nathaniel. She didn't say goodbye. She just walked out of the morning room, her hand firmly anchored in the Duke's, leaving the suffocating smell of stale gin and decaying lilies behind her forever. Did Lydia making the ultimate choice to leave that toxic household behind make you want to cheer? There is no sweeping fairy tale here, just two grounded, imperfect people choosing mud, heavy ledgers, and actual respect over the glittering hypocrisy of high society. If you love the raw tension, the sensory details, and Gideon's unapologetic defiance, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who prefers their historical romance with a bit of dirt and a lot of bite. Subscribe to the channel for more unapologetic, deeply human storytelling. Where do you think Lydia and Gideon go from here? Drop your thoughts in the comments.